He had been working at the company for more than 30 years, moving quietly through the hallways, sweeping floors, emptying trash, and making sure every corner of the building was spotless. Most people didn't notice him, and those who did often treated him as if he were invisible. He wore a plain uniform, carried his cleaning tools, and moved with a kind of careful precision that made it seem like he was part of the walls themselves, blending into the background. Every morning, he arrived before the first light of day, walking through the empty offices as if he were exploring a city at dawn. He knew every floor, every corridor, and every tiny detail of the building. People would often walk past him without a word, too busy with their work, their phones, their meetings, and their endless deadlines. Some of the younger employees whispered jokes about him behind his back, calling him names or pretending to bump into him by accident. Even some of the managers and executives rarely paid attention to him unless they needed something done. It wasn't that they were unkind, but he was simply someone outside their world. He was the janitor, and that meant he belonged in the background. Yet, despite being overlooked, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He greeted people with a nod, a smile, or a soft hello, never expecting much in return. He was patient, and he listened more than he spoke. In the cafeteria, he would sometimes sit quietly at the edge of a table, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the interactions of those around him. He noticed everything: the way people moved, how meetings unfolded, how papers were shuffled, and how messages were sent and received. While others ignored him, he was quietly learning about the company, about how it worked and how it sometimes fell apart. He had grown used to the loneliness. It wasn't a loneliness that hurt, but a kind of quiet that allowed him to see things clearly. He had learned early on that the world often judged by appearances. People saw a uniform, a broom, a trash can, and they assumed they knew everything about the person behind it. Few imagined that a man who cleaned floors could understand the inner workings of a billion-dollar company. Few imagined that he could see patterns where others saw chaos. Every day, he followed the same routine. He started with the top floors, making sure the executive offices were ready before anyone arrived. He swept the corridors, wiped the windows, and made careful notes about anything unusual. Sometimes he noticed leaks in the ceiling, flickering lights, or equipment that wasn't working properly. He didn't just fix what he could. He also noted what needed attention later, making detailed lists for maintenance or management. No one had ever thanked him for the foresight, but he didn't need thanks. It was part of his work, and he took pride in it during the mornings. As the offices filled with people rushing to their desks, he moved quietly, avoiding disruption. He had a way of gliding through the office spaces without being noticed. He had learned to watch and listen without interfering, and over time, began to understand the company better than most of the people in it. He saw the mistakes, the gaps in communication, and the inefficiencies. He saw how a small oversight in one department could ripple across the entire business. He saw opportunities where others only saw problems. But no one asked him for his opinion. He was the janitor, and that meant his ideas were invisible. Lunch hours were the same. He would eat in a quiet corner of the cafeteria, often watching employees talk and laugh, sometimes gossiping about others, sometimes complaining about their workload. He noticed how certain employees avoided responsibility, how some tried to look busy without actually doing much. He noticed the stress in the manager's eyes, the way deadlines hung over their heads like clouds. And he listened to the casual conversations, the murmurs in the hallways, the quiet tensions that nobody admitted aloud. Every piece of information was stored in his mind. Like a puzzle he was slowly putting together. There were moments when he felt invisible, of course. Moments when the younger staff laughed a little too loudly about some small mistake he had made, or when executives walked past without even a nod. Sometimes he would straighten a chair or fix a spilled coffee without being noticed, only to have someone later walk in and comment on how clean the office looked. They never connected it to him. But he had learned a secret. Being overlooked could be a gift. When no one watched too closely, he could see everything clearly, without distraction or bias. And over the years, he had learned to value the quiet perspective that came from being underestimated. He had a simple life outside of work. He lived in a small apartment nearby, cooked his own meals, and enjoyed quiet walks in the evening. But his mind was always busy with ideas, observations, and questions. He wondered why certain processes at the company were so inefficient, why messages were often misunderstood, and why some problems seemed to repeat themselves year after year. And he wondered what it would take to fix them. Most of all, he wondered if anyone would ever take the time to notice. There was one part of the office he loved more than any other, the large main hallway, where the CEO's office and the executive team worked. It was a space of constant movement, of people rushing from meeting to meeting, of phones ringing and emails pinging, and yet, from his perspective, it was like a living organism. He could see how one small change affected the entire system. He could see where delays began, where miscommunications occurred, and where money and resources were being wasted. He often imagined solutions quietly, thinking through steps in his mind as he went about his cleaning. He never shared these thoughts. He didn't have to. They were for him, for the challenge of understanding, for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he could solve problems even if no one asked him to. One morning, a group of executives passed by while he was cleaning the lobby. They were talking loudly about a shipment delay that was costing the company millions. He overheard words like critical, risk, and failure, and he paused for a moment. He noticed a small detail, a mislabeled crate, an overlooked tracking number. It was something minor, almost invisible, but he recognized it immediately. He didn't say anything. The executives were too busy, and they would never have expected a janitor to notice. But he remembered it. He filed it away in his mind, knowing it could be important later. Days passed in much the same way. He moved through the building, observing, cleaning, and thinking. People continued to ignore him, continued to underestimate him, and he continued to quietly watch and understand. He knew that someday something would happen that would show the value of his careful attention. He didn't know when or how, but he believed that knowledge and insight were always valuable, even if they weren't recognized immediately. Even when small accidents happened, like a spilled coffee or a printer jam, he solved them quickly with no fuss. People might notice the immediate result, but they never noticed the skill behind it, the understanding of how things worked and how to fix them efficiently. He had learned patience and humility. He had learned that the world often rewards appearances, not skill, and that sometimes the best work goes unnoticed. But he had also learned that preparation matters, that careful observation, attention to detail, and understanding systems could make a difference when it mattered most. On particularly busy days, when the office was filled with stress and noise, he would sometimes pause for a moment and look out the window. He would watch people hurry to their cars, talking on phones or carrying briefcases, each absorbed in their own world. And he would smile quietly to himself, knowing he had a perspective no one else had. He knew the building like the back of his hand, knew the routines, the problems, and the hidden details. And he knew that one day this knowledge might matter in a way no one expected, and so continued his work, day after day, unnoticed but always aware. A man in a uniform, carrying a mop and bucket, quietly observing a billion-dollar company from the edges of its operations. Humble, patient, and diligent. Overlooked by many, underestimated by most, but quietly preparing himself for the moment when his knowledge, patience, and careful observation would change everything. It started as a small ripple in the office, barely noticed at first. A shipment had been delayed, and the team in logistics couldn't figure out why. At first it seemed minor, but as the days went by, the delays multiplied, spreading like cracks in glass. Orders were missing, inventory was misplaced, and client complaints started to pile up. The executives were called into emergency meetings, and the tension in the building grew thick. The janitor moved through the chaos as he always did, quietly observing, sweeping corridors, and noticing small details that no one else paid attention to. He could feel the unease in the air, the stress behind every hurried step, and every whispered conversation. Managers scrambled to assign blame. Some said it was human error. Others blamed technology. Phone calls flew back and forth, emails piled up, and consultants were brought in to try to fix the problem. They had expensive software, complex charts, and large teams of people, yet the delays continued. Each day, the company lost more money, and no one could find the solution. The janitor watched all of it silently, noticing patterns that nobody else did. He saw how one misrouted package caused delays in 3 different departments. He noticed that the labeling system was confusing and inconsistent. He watched employees try to compensate, creating more errors in the process. It was a web of mistakes. But he could see the thread that connected them all. He had always paid attention to details. But now those details mattered more than ever. While executives panicked, he quietly made his own notes. He recorded the sequence of shipments, the errors in labeling, the paths packages took through the building. He marked down times, dates, and locations. He drew diagrams in a small notebook he kept tucked away in his uniform. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. No one even suspected that the janitor was keeping track of the problem in a way no consultant could. He moved from floor to floor, sometimes pausing to watch employees at work, seeing where things went wrong and where inefficiencies slowed the entire process. Every observation added to his growing understanding of the issue. The executives began to feel the weight of the problem. The CEO called urgent meetings with the heads of every department. Charts were presented, reports were reviewed, and conference rooms were filled with tension. No one could figure out why the error kept repeating. Each solution they tried seemed to fail within days. The problem wasn't just costing money, it was threatening the reputation of the company, the trust of clients, and the confidence of investors. Everyone felt pressure, stress, and frustration. But the janitor remained calm. He had seen problems before, even if they weren't this large, and he knew that panic never solved anything. Careful observation and clear thinking did. One morning, while cleaning the logistics department, he noticed something that everyone else had overlooked. A single misfiled document had caused a chain reaction of errors. The staff had been so busy trying to solve the larger problem that they never went back to check the small, simple details. The janitor saw it immediately. He remembered every detail from his notes. Every time he had observed employees taking the wrong package, every mislabeled shipment. He could trace the path from that one document to the missing orders, to the delayed shipments, to the angry clients. It was a tiny mistake with enormous consequences, and he knew how to fix it. He felt a quiet excitement. This was what he had always known. Small details mattered, and careful attention could reveal solutions where others saw only failure. But he also knew the challenge ahead. No one would expect a janitor to have the answer to a billion-dollar problem. He thought about how executives had brushed him off countless times, how employees had ignored or laughed at him, how he had spent decades moving in the background. Yet he also knew that knowledge and insight didn't depend on recognition. He had the solution. The question was whether anyone would listen. Meanwhile, the company's stress grew. Employees worked long hours trying to undo the damage. Teams were overworked. Morale was low, and mistakes continued to happen despite their efforts. The CEO was becoming visibly anxious. Even the most experienced managers were admitting defeat. Consultants, with their expensive tools and fancy reports, admitted that they were stumped. The janitor watched it all unfold with the patience of someone who had seen cycles like this before. He saw the frustration, the exhaustion, the worry, and he knew that if he stepped forward carefully, he could make a difference. He continued to gather information, moving quietly through the building, observing every action. He noticed how employees tried to cover mistakes rather than correct them, how communication between departments broke down, and how simple misalignments created cascading errors. His notes became a detailed map of the problem, showing exactly how it spread and where the critical points were. He sketched diagrams, wrote timelines, and even began to formulate a step-by-step solution that could correct the errors without further chaos. It was methodical work requiring patience and attention to detail, but it was also work he enjoyed. For the first time, the problem felt like a challenge rather than a source of stress. One afternoon, as he cleaned near the loading docks, he saw a team of employees trying desperately to locate missing shipments. He paused, watching their frustration, and realized that the problem was deeper than anyone had understood. It wasn't just a misfiled document or a misrouted package. It was a systemic flaw in the way the company tracked inventory. A flaw so small that it had gone unnoticed for years, but now had the power to cost billions. He felt a sense of clarity. If he could fix this, the ripple effect would end. Shipments would flow correctly, and the company could recover before the damage became permanent. He knew he had to act, but carefully. Despite the pressure around him, he maintained his routine. He cleaned offices, swept floors, and emptied trash cans, all while thinking through his plan. He even rehearsed in his mind how he would present his findings, knowing that the executives might dismiss him outright. He considered the risks, the possible ridicule, and the challenge of convincing people who had never valued his insight. But he also knew that the solution was real, and that the cost of not speaking up could be catastrophic. The company was depending on someone to see what everyone else had missed, and he was that someone. As the days passed, the problem became more visible. News of delayed shipments reached clients and investors. The tension in the office was almost tangible. Employees whispered in hallways, some pointing fingers at others, some admitting their own mistakes. The CEO's office was a whirlwind of activity, with managers coming and going, reports being shredded and rewritten, consultants offering advice that didn't work. Through it all, the janitor moved quietly, observing every action, connecting every thread. He knew exactly where the chain of errors began, how it had spread, and what needed to be done to stop it. One evening, after the office had emptied and the building was quiet, he sat in the empty cafeteria with his notebook, reviewing every observation he had made. He traced each mistake back to its source, drew lines connecting departments and actions, and wrote down the corrective steps. His handwriting was neat, his diagrams clear. He could see the solution as clearly as day, and for the first time, he felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The solution existed, but presenting it was the next step. He would have to reach out, to step out of the shadows he had inhabited for decades, and risk being ignored or ridiculed. Yet he knew the timing was right. The company needed this solution now more than ever. For the first time, he allowed himself a quiet moment of hope. Despite years of being overlooked, despite decades of moving in the background, he had a chance to make a difference in a way no one would expect. He reviewed his plan again and again, refining the steps, making sure every detail was accounted for. If implemented correctly, the $1 billion problem could be solved. He had seen the path clearly for days, weeks even, and now he knew it was time to act. He left the cafeteria with his notebook carefully tucked under his arm. Walking through the empty hallways with the same quiet confidence he had carried for years, each step felt purposeful, each observation he had made in the past days and months, now forming a coherent strategy. The problem was big, the stakes enormous, but he felt ready. He had always been prepared for the right moment, and now that moment had arrived. The janitor, overlooked by everyone for decades, was about to take the first step toward solving a problem that no one else could. He had spent days, even weeks, quietly observing, taking notes, and connecting the dots. Now, the moment had come to act. He knew that presenting his solution would be risky. He was a janitor, and the company had never considered him capable of solving a problem, let alone a billion-dollar problem. But he had confidence in his observations, in the patterns he had seen, and in the solution he had carefully prepared. Every detail had been documented, every step thought through. He only needed someone to listen. He started with a small approach. He found a middle manager who he had seen struggling to coordinate shipments and explained, as clearly as possible, that he had noticed a specific chain of errors causing the delays. The manager looked at him with surprise, then skepticism. A janitor claiming to have the solution to a billion-dollar problem? It seemed absurd. The janitor calmly showed the manager his notes, diagrams, and timelines, explaining each point logically. The manager hesitated, then nodded slowly. Something about the clarity of the notes made him pause. He promised to bring the matter to someone higher up, though he warned that it might not be taken seriously. Over the next few days, the janitor continued his routine, but now he had a sense of purpose beyond cleaning. He had seen executives make costly mistakes, trying complex solutions that didn't work. He had seen the panic, the stress, and the wasted hours. His quiet confidence grew with each step he had carefully traced. He knew that if the right person would listen, the problem could be fixed. He spent evenings reviewing his notes, refining diagrams, and making sure his explanation was clear and precise. He anticipated questions, prepared answers, and planned for every possible objection. The middle manager eventually set up a brief meeting with a higher-level executive. The janitor was nervous but composed, holding his notebook tightly. He walked into the conference room, where a few senior staff members were already seated. Their faces expressed surprise and disbelief when they saw him. He was small, humble, and unassuming. How could he possibly have the solution? But he had no time to be intimidated. He began by calmly explaining the sequence of events he had observed, pointing to diagrams and noting the specific errors that had caused the cascading delays at first. The executives exchanged puzzled glances. They had consultants, managers, and software systems, yet they were listening to a janitor. He continued anyway, speaking slowly and logically, showing how one misfiled document had triggered a chain of errors across departments. He pointed out labeling mistakes, routing issues, and communication gaps. He explained step by step how these small details had created a problem that was now costing the company millions each day. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He just presented the facts clearly and concisely. A few of the executives began to realize the truth in his observations. One of them leaned forward, asking detailed questions about the shipments and the process he had documented. The janitor answered each question with clarity, showing that he had anticipated the problems and understood the operations better than anyone expected. Slowly, the room began to quiet. The consultants and managers who had been struggling for days could not counter his explanation. It was simple, logical, and accurate. The room had shifted. No longer was he a janitor in their eyes. He was someone who understood the problem completely. He demonstrated exactly what needed to be corrected step by step. First, correcting the labeling system to prevent misrouting. Second, establishing a simple verification process to catch errors before they escalated. Third, adjusting the workflow to account for previous bottlenecks. Each step was practical, actionable, and immediately implementable. The executives began to nod, seeing a path forward where none had existed before. He continued calmly, pointing to diagrams, timelines, and notes, ensuring that the plan was understandable to everyone in the room. By the end of the meeting, the executives were stunned. A simple, humble man who spent his days cleaning offices had solved a problem that had baffled highly educated professionals and consultants. The CEO, who had initially dismissed the idea, now leaned back in his chair, silently studying the janitor and the notebook full of observations. He realized that the solution was not only correct but also elegant in its simplicity. It didn't require expensive software, massive restructuring, or weeks of additional work. It only required careful attention to detail, observation, and a willingness to correct small errors that had gone unnoticed for years. The CEO asked the janitor to stay and explain further. He outlined how each department would implement the changes and how long it would take to correct the errors. He answered questions from managers, providing clarity and insight. Every word was measured and precise, showing that he had thought about this thoroughly. The executives who had once overlooked him now saw him as a valuable contributor. The room, once filled with disbelief, was now filled with quiet amazement. He had not only identified the problem, but had also provided the solution in a way that everyone could understand and implement. After the meeting, word spread quickly. Staff who had once ignored or mocked him now looked at him with newfound respect. He walked through the office the next day, moving quietly as always, but noticing the subtle glances of acknowledgement and the smiles of gratitude. He did not seek praise, but he felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his observations had made a difference. He had been prepared for decades. Now his preparation was paying off. Implementation began slowly, each department adjusting to the changes he had recommended. Managers followed his instructions, verifying each step to ensure the solution was working. For the first time in weeks, shipments were moving correctly, delays were disappearing, and client complaints were reducing. Staff began to see the results of his work, and the problem that had seemed impossible to solve was now being resolved step by step. The janitor continued his routine, moving quietly through the building, observing and noting the progress. He had learned long ago that patience and attention to detail were more powerful than haste and noise. As the days passed, the executives began to understand the full impact of his solution. The billion-dollar problem was no longer spiraling out of control. Orders were being fulfilled on time, errors were being caught before they caused damage, and confidence in the company was returning. The CEO personally reviewed the progress, noting the efficiency and clarity of the janitor's plan. It was not just effective, it was transformative. The company had been blind to its own flaws, and a humble observer had provided the clarity they needed to recover. The janitor's humility remained. He did not seek recognition or awards. He continued his cleaning duties, quietly observing the office and the improvements taking place. Yet now, the respect of others was visible. Managers nodded politely, employees smiled warmly. Even the CEO occasionally stopped to ask a question or thank him for his insight. The world had shifted in subtle ways around him, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through action, knowledge, and quiet determination. He reflected on the journey so far. For decades, he had been unnoticed, overlooked, and underestimated. He had moved through the world quietly, gathering observations, understanding processes, and preparing for the right moment. That moment had arrived, and he had acted with courage and clarity. He had stepped forward despite the risk of ridicule or dismissal, and his careful preparation had made all the difference. The billion-dollar problem was being solved, and the company was beginning to recover. And yet, he remained grounded. Knowing that the work was not yet complete and that continued observation and diligence would be necessary to ensure lasting success, his story began to inspire others, even in quiet ways. Employees who had once doubted their own ability to solve problems now paid attention to small details, observing processes with more care. Managers became more receptive to input from staff at all levels. The office culture began to shift subtly, with an appreciation for observation, patience, the value of every individual, regardless of title or role. The janitor's actions had started a ripple effect that went beyond the immediate problem, changing the way people thought about knowledge, insight, and contribution. Through it all, he maintained his humility. He knew that the recognition was temporary, but the knowledge and skill he had applied would have lasting effects. He continued to clean offices, sweep floors, and empty trash, moving quietly through the building with the same careful attention as always. But now he did so with a quiet confidence, knowing that even the smallest observation, when applied correctly, could have extraordinary impact. And he knew that his journey was far from over. The problem was being solved, but he would remain vigilant, prepared for whatever challenge came next. The next few days were a whirlwind in the company. The janitor continued his work quietly, moving through the offices and corridors, sweeping floors, emptying trash, and keeping the building spotless as always. But now, his presence was different. People no longer ignored him. Employees who had once walked past without a word now nodded or smiled, some even stopping to ask questions about the improvements they were seeing. Managers began to consult him, subtly at first, asking for clarification on small details of the plan he had proposed. And the CEO, once skeptical, now watched the progress closely. Amazed at how smoothly the changes were being implemented, the solution had been set in motion. Each department had adjusted according to his plan, and the results were immediate. Shipments were moving correctly, orders were arriving on time, and errors that had caused months of frustration were disappearing. The company's operations, once chaotic, were now stabilizing. Employees began to see the results of the janitor's careful observation and methodical approach. Where there had been confusion, there was now clarity. Where there had been mistakes, there was now accuracy. And as the improvements spread, morale in the office began to rise. The CEO called a company-wide meeting. Employees filled the large auditorium, many still unaware of the role the janitor had played. The air was thick with curiosity and anticipation. The CEO began to speak about the recent challenges, acknowledging the stress, the errors, and the potential losses. Then, slowly, he shifted the focus. He spoke of the solution, of the careful observations that had uncovered the root cause, and of the person who had provided it. Silence filled the room as he mentioned the janitor by name, the man who had been invisible, overlooked for decades, was now standing in front of hundreds of employees, his uniform clean but simple, his eyes calm but alert. The reaction was immediate. People stared in disbelief, whispering among themselves. How could someone who cleaned floors have solved a problem that had stumped executives and consultants for weeks? The janitor remained composed, nodding politely as the CEO recounted his observations and explained the steps he had proposed. The clarity of his analysis, the precision of his notes, and the effectiveness of his solution were undeniable. Slowly, applause began to fill the room. At first hesitant, then growing louder, employees stood and clapped for the man they had overlooked for so long. The CEO smiled, acknowledging the importance of recognizing talent wherever it could be found. The janitor felt a quiet warmth, but said nothing. He had never sought recognition or praise. His satisfaction came from knowing that the problem was being solved and that his observations had made a difference. Yet in this moment, he allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of the gratitude and respect being shown to him. For decades, he had worked in silence, unnoticed and underestimated. Now, he stood at the center of a room filled with people who had once ignored him. And the acknowledgement was almost overwhelming. Managers and employees approached him throughout the day, asking questions, seeking advice, or simply expressing their amazement. Some apologized for overlooking him. Others admitted they had underestimated his capabilities. He accepted their words with humility, reminding them that the solution was the important part, not the recognition. And yet each acknowledgement reinforced the truth he had known for years. Careful observation, attention to detail, and persistence were more valuable than titles or status. The CEO took a personal interest in his work. He asked the janitor to walk through the changes with him, explaining the reasoning behind each step. They moved from department to department, observing the implementation of his plan. The CEO was impressed not only by the effectiveness of the solution, but also by the way the janitor had anticipated potential problems and designed measures to prevent them. It was clear that the plan had been crafted with years of careful observation, patience, and understanding of the company's inner workings. The CEO began to understand the full scope of the janitor's skill and insight. Employees noticed a change in the company culture. There was now a newfound appreciation for observation, careful work, and insight from unexpected sources. Teams began to communicate more effectively, double-checking details and verifying processes. Employees who had previously felt their contributions were minor now realized that small actions could have significant impacts. The janitor's example became a quiet but powerful lesson in the value of diligence, patience, and attention to detail. In the following weeks, the company continued to recover. The billion-dollar problem, which had caused so much stress and uncertainty, was fully resolved. Orders flowed smoothly, client satisfaction increased, and financial stability returned. The janitor continued his daily routines, moving through the building with the same calm demeanor as always. He cleaned, observed, and made notes when necessary. But now there was a subtle change in the way he was treated. He was no longer invisible. He was respected, consulted, and valued for his insight. And yet he remained humble, focused on the work rather than the accolades. The story of the janitor began to spread. Employees shared the tale of how a quiet, diligent man had solved a problem that had baffled highly trained professionals. It became a story of inspiration, showing that talent and insight could come from anywhere, and that humility, patience, and observation were often overlooked but powerful qualities. The janitor's actions reminded everyone that recognition should not be limited by title or position, and that every individual had the potential to make a difference if given the opportunity to observe, learn, and contribute. The CEO, recognizing the significance of the janitor's contribution, made a public statement about the importance of valuing all employees, regardless of role or title. He emphasized that brilliance could come from unexpected places, and that the company would implement programs to ensure that voices from every level of the organization could be heard. The janitor, quiet and humble as ever, continued to move through the company. His work unchanged, but his presence now recognized and appreciated. Through it all, the janitor remained grounded. He understood that the recognition and praise were not the goal. The goal was the work itself, the careful observation, the attention to detail, and the understanding of processes that made the company function effectively. He continued to clean, to observe, and to prepare for challenges. Knowing that his skills and insight could be called upon again, the impact of his actions extended beyond the immediate problem, shaping the culture of the company and inspiring others to value diligence, observation, and contribution from every individual. Employees who had once dismissed him now sought his advice on various matters, from small operational challenges to larger strategic questions. Managers began to consult him quietly, respecting his perspective and valuing his input. The janitor, while appreciative of the trust placed in him, continued to approach every situation with humility, focusing on the facts, the details, and the practical solutions rather than personal recognition. He knew that the true measure of his work was the success of the company and the well-being of its employees. The company thrived as a result. The changes implemented under his guidance not only resolved the immediate problem, but also improved efficiency, communication, and morale across the organization. Employees learned to pay attention to details. Managers learned to listen to insights from all levels. And the company began to operate with a level of clarity and effectiveness that had been missing before. The janitor's role, once overlooked, had now become a symbol of the power of observation, patience, and careful thought. And yet he remained the same quiet, diligent man who had walked through the halls for decades, cleaning, observing, and preparing for the right moment to act. The company had begun to breathe again. The billion-dollar problem that had threatened its operations was no longer a looming disaster. Orders flowed smoothly, shipments arrived on time, and employees moved with renewed confidence. The janitor continued his daily work as he had for decades, sweeping floors, cleaning offices, and keeping the building orderly. But now, there was a subtle difference in the way people saw him. They no longer glanced past him or ignored his presence. Managers and employees paused to acknowledge him, some stopping to ask a question or quietly thank him for his contribution. The CEO, who had once doubted the value of his insight, now frequently sought his perspective on minor operational matters. Recognizing the clarity and detail in his observations, despite the attention, he remained humble. He had never sought recognition. His satisfaction had always come from the quiet confidence that he understood systems and could notice what others missed. Now, however, the impact of his work was visible to all. The company, which had been teetering on the edge of chaos, was stabilizing, and the improvements were more than just operational. They were cultural. Employees began to appreciate the value of careful observation and attention to detail. Teams started communicating more effectively, verifying tasks and double-checking processes. The ripple effect of the janitor's actions went far beyond solving the immediate problem. Word of his accomplishments spread beyond the walls of the company. Local media picked up the story of a humble janitor who had solved a billion-dollar problem. It became an inspirational tale, shared across social media and professional networks. People marveled at how someone in a position often overlooked could demonstrate such insight and impact. The story highlighted the importance of valuing employees at every level and recognizing that intelligence, skill, and creativity could come from unexpected sources. In offices and homes alike, people began to reflect on how they judged others based on titles or appearances. And the janitor's story became a symbol of humility and perseverance. Within the company, his role evolved. He was invited to observe departmental meetings, offering insights when appropriate, always quietly, always with humility. His observations helped refine processes and prevent minor errors from escalating into significant problems. Managers and employees learned to consult him, not because he held a formal title, but because his perspective was valuable. The office culture shifted subtly but meaningfully, fostering respect for diligence, patience, and knowledge gained through careful observation. Where once his presence was overlooked, it was now valued and appreciated. The CEO, deeply impressed by the janitor's contribution, initiated a new program to encourage input from employees at all levels. The program was designed to identify and nurture insights that might otherwise be missed due to hierarchical barriers. The janitor's example served as a cornerstone for this initiative. Meetings were held to discuss ways to gather ideas from staff in various positions, and employees were encouraged to speak up without fear of dismissal. The company began to operate with a renewed sense of inclusivity and recognition. And the janitor's story became a guiding example of how observation and insight could transform not just a single problem, but the culture of an entire organization. Despite the newfound recognition, the janitor continued to live simply. He walked the same paths through the office, cleaned the same floors, performed his duties with the same care and attention as before. Yet, his internal world had changed. He now knew that the skills he had honed over decades were valuable, that his quiet diligence had the power to make a difference, and that preparation and observation could overcome even the largest challenges. He remained focused on his work, never seeking praise, but appreciating the acknowledgement he had earned through action and results. Employees, who had once doubted him, now sought his advice on a variety of matters. Small questions about operational efficiency, communication, and workflow were brought to him, and he answered with the same calm clarity that had solved the billion-dollar problem. Managers valued his perspective, consultants respected the insights he provided, and even the CEO consulted him on matters that required careful observation and understanding. His life had changed in terms of recognition, but not in terms of character. He remained grounded, diligent, and patient, continuing to work quietly while influencing the company in profound ways. The long-term impact of his actions became evident over the following months. Processes that had been vulnerable to error were corrected. Communication between departments improved, and efficiency increased across the organization. Employees felt empowered to contribute ideas, to observe carefully, and to trust their insights. The culture shifted from one where rank determined influence to one where observation, diligence, and knowledge were respected, regardless of title. The janitor's story became a daily reminder that meaningful contribution often comes from preparation, attention to detail, and quiet perseverance. He continued to take note of small issues, preventing minor problems from becoming larger ones. His daily walks through the office, once unnoticed, now carried an air of quiet authority. People stopped to listen when he spoke, knowing that his insights were rooted in observation and experience. Even small actions, such as reorganizing supplies, streamlining minor workflows, correcting errors before they spread, became valued contributions. The company thrived not just because a major problem had been solved, but because the culture of observation and careful attention he inspired had taken root. The CEO made a point of publicly recognizing the janitor's contribution at company gatherings and in internal communications. Awards and acknowledgments were offered, but he continued to remain humble, accepting gratitude without seeking the spotlight. His focus was on the work itself, on understanding processes, and on helping the company operate more smoothly. Employees admired not only his insight, but also his character. He demonstrated that success was not measured by titles or wealth, but by the ability to observe, understand, and act effectively. Over time, the janitor's influence extended beyond operational improvements. His story inspired other employees to reconsider their own approach to work and life. Attention to detail, patience, and careful observation became guiding principles. Employees who had previously felt undervalued discovered that their insights mattered. Managers learned to listen to staff at all levels. The culture shifted, fostering collaboration, respect, and recognition for contributions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The janitor, ever humble, continued his routine with the same dedication he had always shown. Yet he now walked with a quiet confidence, knowing that the work he did every day simple, careful, and unnoticed for so long, had changed the company in ways that would last for years. He knew that recognition, while meaningful, was secondary to the true value of his contribution, the ability to observe, understand, and act in ways that solved problems and improved the lives of those around him. His story became a touchstone for the company, a reminder that talent and insight could come from unexpected places, and that recognition and respect should be afforded to all who contribute meaningfully. The culture he inspired continued to grow, shaped by his humility, diligence, and careful observation. Employees learned to value each other's contributions, managers learned to listen, and the company as a whole became stronger, more resilient, and more capable of facing future challenges. The janitor's life remained simple, but his impact was profound. He continued to perform his duties with care, moving quietly through the building, observing, noting, and ensuring that the systems he had helped improve continued to function smoothly. Yet, in the eyes of those around him, he was no longer invisible. He was a symbol of perseverance, observation, humility, and the power of quiet diligence. His actions had solved a billion-dollar problem, transformed the company's culture, and inspired countless employees to see the value of careful attention and insight. And in that quiet, unassuming way, he continued to make a difference every single day.